The following programming is made possible through a generous donation from Randall Lewis, Executive Vice President of Upland-based Lewis Operating Companies.
Welcome again to another Randall Lewis seminar. We were honored last night to have Thom Reilly present an overview and a discussion of his book, which is called The Failure of Governance in Bell, California, Big-Time Corruption in a Small Town. It was an important seminar for two reasons. One, the kind of credentials and research and perspective Thom Reilly brought to this look at Bell, but also the questions about what took place there and what, beyond being kind of an outlier story, what it means for all of us who worry about public service and accountability. But Thom, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
We're honored to have you here in Riverside and to participate in the Randall Lewis seminar. I think first, sort of, who are you? That is, you bring really extraordinary credentials, both of somebody who's participated at the highest kind of governmental level, and at the same time participates with the highest at the kind of academic levels. And you're now really in charge of the higher education system and Reno, or in Nevada. Tell us something about yourself.
Sure. So, actually, I started as a social worker years and years ago. But I'm a longtime public servant. I ran the child welfare system in Nevada for a period of time. I ended up becoming a county executive or county manager of Clark County, which is both a regional and municipal type government, referred to the Las Vegas Valley.
It's a big county, right?
It's a big county, and it's interesting because the county also is the largest provider of municipal services. So when people go to Las Vegas and they look at the Las Vegas Strip and the airport and the University of Nevada, Las Vegas and the Convention Authority, those are actually not in the city of Las Vegas. They're in the town of Paradise because of some laws that were created that prevented the annexation of towns that were created prior to 1983. So in traditional sense, municipalities annex unincorporated areas of Clark County, and counties become more the regional body where municipalities do city type services. That's not the case in Clark County. So Clark County is actually the most powerful arm of government, larger than the state, and kind of controls a lot of not only the purse strings, but a lot of what's happening.
So you were CEO for 5 years?
I was CEO for 5 years. In my career, I've gone back and forth between academia and the real world. I ended up at Arizona State University running the Morrison Institute, which is a public policy think tank. And then after that, in my recent position as Chancellor of the Nevada System of Higher Education. In Nevada, we have one system of higher education, so everything from community colleges to our state universities are part of that system.
So in California terms, you're the Janet Napolitano of the state of Nevada.
In a smaller term, and we include community colleges and our state college. Yeah. Now, as far as the book here, it attracted me for a couple of reasons. As an academic, my research focus has been on public pay and benefits. So I've looked at public compensation for a long period of time. So obviously the story of Bell, where the city administrator is making this extraordinary, unbelievable amount of money, attracted me. But also having some personal experience on the issue of corruption. When I was a county executive, it was during the time of a G-string operation in Clark County, where actually 4 of the county commissioners were indicted and actually convicted and went to prison during my tenure there too. So I had a personal, dealt with a lot of personal issues around corruption and what that means as a public official that is dealing with a tremendous amount of distrust of government anyway. And then when you have these stories of corruption come out there that are such high profile and scandalous, given it involves strip clubs, It's a challenge because, many individuals in their mind, it's just, it just reinforces their idea that government's corrupt. So those two factors, both just understanding retirement systems and also having this personal experience around the issue of corruption, really attracted me to the story of Bell, California.
For those who don't know much about Bell, which is probably most of us, tell us a little, where is it, and if you could just give a quick kind of profile of the city of Bell.
Sure. So the city of Bell is one of the many cities in the county of LA County. It's it's southeast of downtown LA. It's a municipality of about 2.8 square miles, about 35,000 residents. 90% of it's one of the poorest cities in LA County. The average annual income is about $28,000. The city is made up of about 35,000 individuals. About 90% are Latino, and a good percent are not there legally. During in 2010, actually, the two LA Times reporters were in the adjacent city, the city right next to them, the city of Maywood, that was actually dealing with some challenges themselves where they were laying off the majority of their employees. When some citizens who were kind of frustrated with the government in Bell, the city, kind of gave them a tip that, the people next door are kind of making a lot of money. Can you look into it? That investigation led to a Pulitzer Prize winning series in the LA Times by the two reporters that uncovered this incredible, extraordinary amount of corruption that was led by the city administrator, Bob Rizzo, and his assistant city manager, Angela Spaccia.
We often think of corruption somehow as somebody getting direct money. When we talk about corruption in Bell, what are we talking about?
Yeah, so if we put it in perspective, on average, there's about 1,000 convictions a year of public corruption, which is basically putting private interest ahead of the public good in public office. So that involves theft, perjury, bribery, etc. So where it's clear that the overwhelming majority of public officials, both elected and public servants, are good, honest, decent individuals, it's a fair amount of corruption occurring.
There's there is about 500,000 elected officials, and I don't know, there's obviously several million public servants out there.
So, in Bell, California, so the story was scandalous. I mean, the New York Times, after they did their investigation, how they did their investigation is very interesting. I actually detail this in my book, where there's a meeting in a small park where the LA Times reporters go to meet Bob Rizzo and his legion of attorneys and elected officials. And the two LA Times reporters says as they were getting out of the car, they thought maybe it was an ambush. It was, they were really scared of what they were walking into. But it resulted in the LA Times front page that says, "Is your city manager worth $800,000?" And of course, that was only part of the story because, again, in this town of 35,000, a very small town, less than 3 miles, for someone to make that type of salary was extraordinary. But when you added the benefits, because part of this whole issue of the corruption involved the issue of manipulating the retirement system and retirement plans, Bob Rizzo, the city administrator, is actually making $1.5 million when you consider his total compensation.
He'd be the highest paid city manager by far.
It was beyond belief. Yes. And his city administrator was making, a little less than $400,000 for total compensation of less than $800,000. The city police chief was making $457,000. Just straight salary, on top of that, benefits.
You go into this really very carefully in your book, but maybe just before going into what's in the book, how did you study this Bell scandal? What approach did you use?
Well, so the beginning narrative and what was well detailed in the LA Times series and elsewhere was the story of this vulnerable town made up largely of immigrants, many of them not there legally, a poor community. The media had stopped covering most of the municipalities because of the cutback, so the LA Times went there, so there wasn't a lot of sunlight on what was going on. There was a disengaged public, and that made the city very vulnerable to some crafty individuals that came in there. But what I was kind of interested in was two aspects of that. One was how this corruption occurred in a form of government, the council manager form of government, that was actually designed at the turn of the century to combat corruption. So, if we look at, there's basically, and I'm simplifying this, two forms of government when we look at local governments: a strong mayor type of government and a council manager form of government. Having said that, there's all sorts of hybrids and they're blending more today. But during the turn of the century, the strong mayor type of government was predominant, and that's where you had a mayor who had executive powers to actually run the municipality. During the reform era, the council manager form of government emerged, where they would hire a professionally trained administrator, and then the mayor and the council would serve as a check and balance, the elected officials. So they would be the policymakers. They would hire a professionally trained individual to run the day-to-day activities. For years and years, in our profession in public administration, it's kind of the cornerstone of good governance. So I was really kind of intrigued by the notion is that the very form of government that was formed to combat corruption around this big boss Tweed type mayor was evident in this small town. The second thing I want to mention was why I was interested in is that in most forms of corruption, it usually involves a very few number of individuals. So there is the case of someone bribing an elected official. In the city of Bell, everybody was complicit. So anyone that could have done something, should have done something, was actually complicit, or they're burying their heads in the sand. And all the check and balance systems, with the council, with the auditor, with the attorneys, with the unions, all that failed at one time, which made this a pretty extraordinary study.
Well, I want to get back to that because I think that's really an important thread in the book. But just very briefly, for those who are not, one, how did he do this? I mean, how do you create a salary and so forth and benefits for employees around you? How did he do it? And particularly in a poor city like Bell, how did he fund it?
So Bob Rizzo was actually hired in the city of Bell in 1993, and it was a time that the city was actually recovering from a former corruption that involved the poker clubs, that involved actually a city administrator and the mayor. But he was really credited when he came in there as right-sizing and financially.
He was a professional city manager. He came, his previous job, I think, was in the high desert, right?
Yes, and he came as a city manager, so he was seen initially as someone who was viewed very positively. In a short period of time, the city got back its financial standing. Residents had commented that graffiti was disappearing, that the police were responding quicker, that it was cleaner. He developed sports programs for the city youth. And so Bob Rizzo was actually, at the time, viewed very positively as a very successful trained administrator to come into the city of Bell. So that was 1993. The story came out in 2010. So it's a long period of time. And so nothing happens overnight. And so if you look at how Bob Rizzo operated, is that as his previous tenure as a city administrator, there were some problems. He was actually dismissed and it never came out. But he was really planting the seed of manipulating how the government was operating, bullying individuals, creating a form of government that was so incomprehensible and hard to follow. But in 2003, he made a critical hire. It was a woman by the name of Angela Spasia, who he hired as an assistant too. During the trial, they were seen as the two culprits, and they actually blamed each other. So Angela Spasia presented herself as a helpless public servant who was being directed by this mafiosa type bully who made her do things. On his part, he said basically is that she was the mastermind behind all the schemes around building a retirement system and figuring out how they extract money from it. So it happened in a long period of time. But, when the story came out there, I really needed some type of theory or some type of lens to look at it differently. And so in my book, I kind of outlined 4 different lenses or theoretical frameworks to help me look at it from a different perspective. And that helped guide my analysis to kind of get further insight than just what was in the newspaper.
Well, before you identify me those 4 lenses, how did the city manager Rizzo fund these sort of major increases in salary for so many people?
Yeah, he extracted money in a host of different ways. One area is that, one of the major funding sources of local government's property taxes. So he raised property taxes. It's actually the second highest property tax of all the cities in LA County, higher than Beverly Hills. Keep in mind that it's one of the poorest cities in LA County. He also extracted money by bonding against a sports facility that was never built. They shook down businesses. In fact, it became so well known of code enforcement going after businesses. One businessman prominently in his check he wrote to the city of Bell was bribe. He actually put that in the memo. Probably one of the more insidious ways that they raised money was to prey on a pretty vulnerable population, where they used code enforcement and the police to actually impound cars. So as was explained to one of the police chiefs who actually pointed out how they identified cars, is that they would look at cars or pickup trucks that either had lawn maintenance or painting seen as painters, and what the notion is that if they target these individuals, they're not legally, or they had family members that weren't. So at the height, they were impounding 8 cars a day. A lot of these are cash transactions. The impound fee was twice that of the city of LA. So they had these multiple ways to try to extract revenue from the community, and part of that was not only give themselves very lucrative salaries, but as I mentioned before, total compensation became the key, because they built these retirement systems of not only manipulating the state retirement system under CalPERS, but also developing private retirement. So they had this very lucrative payout when they were going to exit the city.
People who didn't follow the Bell case, just kind of a closure on when they went to trial finally, what was the outcome of the trials?
So there was convictions both of the city council and mayor for the 5 city councilmen, and Bob Rizzo and Angela Spaccia. It was interesting. Bob Rizzo was actually convicted. He received 12 years a sentence and an $8.8 million restitution. He, I won't go into a lot of the details too, but he was convicted under federal and state, and his attorney actually argued quite forcefully that he be convicted under federal statute too, because during the time that Bob Rizzo was extracting revenue and having this extraordinary salary, he was raising thoroughbreds in the state of Washington. So there was some tax evasion that came there. And the strategy behind getting him under federal statute is that he was able to serve part of his sentence in federal prison, which of course, that if you go to prison, many view the federal system as less harsh because there's more white collar crimes there. But interesting about Bob Rizzo is that he never talked. So during the time he was deposed, I counted up that he took the fifth 115 times. Wow. And the only glimpse of that came out about his management style was done by an attorney, Anthony Taylor, who actually had his undergraduate degree in public administration. So he was kind of intrigued about what was his management style. And the only thing he actually talked about, and the only glimpse we had on public record of his management style came from those transcripts. He pled. He never testified. In fact, the attorney for Angela Spaccia really criticized this quite a bit, because when he pled, they expected him to shed more light on what type of corruption occurred. He wasn't even personally interviewed for his probation report. during the sentencing, the media wasn't even there. And to this day, he really has not publicly talked at all. Angela Spaccia pretty much got the same sentence. She got a little less than 12 years in state prison and about $8 million in restitution. But she, where he didn't talk, she talked and talked and talked and talked, and she went to trial. And she lied about every little detail, frustrating the prosecution and the judge by extraordinary means, because she would lie about little things. And so both of those were convicted. The city council and the mayor was actually, they had ranges from a small amount of time in jail to restitution to time served in probation. The city was able to recover through good work of some of the attorneys, about $28 million back into the city coffers. They hired some professionally trained administrators. There was a great effort of many professionally trained administrators from other areas in California to come to help rebuild. Citizens took back their city. Pre-Bell, there would be 4 or 5 people at a city council meeting, hundreds attend now. And actually the city of Bell has been awarded they've been awarded for some of their really progressive government about transparency and engaging citizens, but it came at a high cost.
Let me just read one, I thought, powerful paragraph. This is in your final chapter, which you call postscript. But while the levels of checks and balances vary across cities, the astonishing thing about the Bell scandal is all the systems failed at the same time, or were virtually non-existent when needed the most. Engaged citizens, community organizations, unions, news media, none countered the growing centralization of power in Rizzo's hands. State professional organizations failed to detect any hint of wrongdoing, even when Bell employees and citizens reached out to them. That's a startling paragraph, is that all these potential checks didn't work.
It's frightening. I mean, again, I go back to the cornerstone of our profession in public administration is that, we have these check and balance systems. So what you had in this system is you had a professionally trained administrator who received his master's in public administration, by the way. You had a contract attorney that would have its check and balance system. You had an elected board that has to check and balance between the trained administrator. You had audits done by auditing firms.
It's required. Every city has an annual audit.
That came in there over the years. You had bondholders on bonding for the sports complex. You had unions. You had business groups. And citizens did reach out. I have a whole chapter in there talking about some of the pleas that citizens had made about some of the wrongdoings that were occurring, and really in many cases fell upon deaf ears. But that, I think, is what makes Bell a cautionary tale, because you have a system that is designed for these checks and balance system, and when you look at it, how did all of them fail at the same time? And I think part of that is why, I go back to, I needed different lenses to actually look at and gain insight into this. And a couple, I won't go into a lot of them in detail, but one of this is about this idea of political monopolies, is that, which argues that, it's not really the type of system, whether it's a strong mayor or the council manager form of government, is that both can be exploitive in the end. And in the case of Bell, what happened is that they really ceased having elections. So the way their charter was written, where if no one applied, then they could appoint. Well, if the citizens never knew there was an opening, you could never apply. And so over the years, what Bob Rizzo had done is actually appoint his own city council, targeting individuals who were weak, who he could manipulate. And so a period of time, you cease having the elections, which really account for the issue of honesty and the check and balance system. So you did away with that, holding your elected officials accountable, because they were basically, for the most part, appointed by Bob Rizzo, who manipulated those. The second area was, revenue extraction, is how they really, Bob Rizzo and Angela Spaccia, operated in the sense of, the theories go that there's something called a stationary bandit and a rover bandit. And a stationary bandit, basically does a good amount of economic development in the city because what attracts them to Graft is their ability to extract wealth from its citizens. But you don't want to drive all your wealth out of the citizens, out of the community, because you have nothing to extract. And in fact, during the turn of the century, many our cities survived a tremendous amount of graft is because you had these stationary bandits who basically realized that you don't want to drive businesses away because you don't have any money to extract. So you do economic development at the same time you're extracting money. The problem is when you become a rover bandit, and rovers you're only concerned about extracting because you have a short-term horizon. And there's evidence to suggest that Bob Rizzo and Angelo Spascia had a time they were going to leave. It was actually in 2008, where they were going to actually, manipulate their retirement system, extract the money, and then leave. So they became these short-term bandits, less interested in economic development because they drove businesses out and became these rover bandits. The other area was this notion of geographic contagion, that kind of like a contagious disease, can corruption be contagious? And there's evidence to suggest that, at the core you have the basic elements of corruption, but it can spread to neighboring cities. It diminishes once you get from the point, but if you look at the areas of southeastern, the cities on there, almost all the major cities that are adjacent to the city of Bell have been involved in major corruption scandals because you have some of the same players that were occurring. So what Bob Rizzo did over his long tenure is that he kind of created this system of government that one is he appointed his own council. He manipulated and bullied those that didn't agree. I mean, he clearly bullied the city attorney. It was clear through the email exchange and what was uncovered is that he wasn't a check and balance system. He worked for Bob Rizzo. Bob even hired 2 outside attorneys over a 3-year period, each of them.
As an elected official, you do look to the city attorney and say, is this legal? Following the law.
And he clearly, I mean, it was crazy. I mean, even when they would sign documents, Ed Lee, the city attorney, he had they were using a paperclip form with his signature, and they would just paperclip it to a new thing. But the other thing what he did is that he created this form of government that was so incomprehensible you couldn't follow it. So, for example, when you go to a city council meeting and you have an agenda item, there's backup that says what the agenda item is, and you can follow it, and that's required by state law. In that case, the backup never even mirrored what was posted. And if you looked at his budget, he had a 5-year budget plan. And I know a little bit about budget. I had a $4 billion budget I managed at the county, and I could not understand it.
He had a 5-year plan.
Yeah, 5-year plan that was totally incomprehensible. So for those that even tried to follow what was happening, you couldn't do it. And that was part of his plan, to create this confusion and chaos, bully individuals, appoint people, pay his staff very high to bring them in. And let me mention one other thing which he did. He even co-opted employees in a sense that he ran this illegal loan program that actually a lot of his convictions he was convicted on, which he basically allowed for staff to get no interest loans by collateralizing their sick and annual leave. And almost every employee was involved in receiving this. So, and one last thing is that he didn't allow a lot of his employees to go to conferences, to leave. He kept them isolated so he could control what was happening.
One tool cities have is this sort of annual audit. I guess it's required by state law to do. Why didn't the annual audit work?
Well, one is that they didn't rotate the auditors. So, some just felt that it was sloppy and that individuals kind of came in there and they just, it was the same audit that they would do and just kind of change a couple numbers and approve it.
In a good government sense, you should change your audit.
Yeah, I mean, you should change to make sure you're getting new eyes on it. And you're required to bring in an outside auditor. They did. They used the same one, and it was just became a lot more routine. So with the unions, he basically cut a deal with them to give them their salaries they wanted and stopped collective bargaining. So there wasn't even any negotiation. So the tension that you might have and the oversight between the union and the city was gone. The businesses were pretty non-existent. He ended up running most of the businesses out of the city, which has long-term effects on the economic development of Bell. But it wasn't something, it was kind of this long period that was very strategic to develop total control over the city.
You have some comment in your book about whistleblowers that they were there before the LA Times story. Is that correct?
Yeah, in fact, from the very beginning, there was actually one individual that came up at the city council meeting and asked, a couple things. When are we going to get that sports complex? And they would just kind of laugh and say, "Oh, you know how it is. It's kind of hard to, it's the bureaucracy. It takes a long period of time." And then he started questioning about, stood up and asked about salaries, which again he was kind of bullied into and joked about. He asked for public documents. They gave him the wrong documents because one of the strategies that Bob Rizzo and his administrators did is that he had 5 phantom agencies. So they were agencies that met simultaneously to the city council meeting that were non-existent. So when you looked at asking him what his salary was as city administrator, it may have been $180,000, but he had 4 other salaries tied to these phantom agencies. And so when someone would ask what the salary is as a city administrator, they would get this, false reporting of what occurred. So others had written pretty detailed letters to the district attorney's office and the state attorney general's office about concerns about employees that had a conflict on businesses or these large salaries that came out there. And they weren't investigated, basically. Even the professional organizations, there were individuals that noted to some of the professional organizations that the salaries were pretty extraordinary. Right after Bob Rizzo kind of changed the form of government to make it a charter city to escape, he thought, some of the oversight of the state. Right after that, he increased his salary and Angela Spascia's salary by 50%. And then subsequently, you saw these very high increases. Well, all that was actually reported to CalPERS, which is the retirement system.
Doesn't CalPERS have any kind of alarm system?
Yeah, you would think, that there'd be some red flags to look at this excessive compensation. Now, CalPERS got out of paying the retirement system because of a provision that those type of increases had to come to a public vote. So what Bob Rizzo was doing is that he was just approving these large salary increases for himself and some of his administrators by not taking it to a vote of the board. In fact, Randy Adams, when he was negotiating to come over as police chief from Glendale to Bell, he questioned that. He asked specifically, I've been around government for a while, don't you have to take to the city council? Rizzo said no, he can do that himself. But the point is that CalPERS was on record of knowing these increases and never did anything.
We thank you for taking your time as an academic, taking your time as a public administrator, professor, and professional to focus all our attention on the city of Bell and what it represents for us. I don't know, this is probably a couple years in the writing and in research. You've obviously taken this on the road. You've had to answer questions about it. As you kind of step back, what have you learned from this experience of writing the book?
Well, a couple things. One is that, people argue that this perhaps is an outlier, which I agree. I think the extraordinary corruption that occurred in this very small town. But, there's elements perhaps, at least a perception throughout many municipalities is that there are things not going totally as they should. When this came out, the LA Times reporters received calls from all over the nation of saying, investigate my town. So I think when I actually do public speaking, you have a fair number of individuals who are, who at least their belief is that things aren't being run correctly. Is that transparency? Is that part of what's happening? Is it Bell occurring on a smaller scale? But I think the issue, 2 things. One is that there needs to be a lot of transparency so citizens feel connected to what's happening in government. And the other thing is that the demise of the print media not covering municipalities, I think, is a real problem.
I mean, and it's going to get worse. I mean, that is the capacity of newspapers to cover cities, much less don't cover special districts and aren't covering school districts. You have any thoughts about, with the increasingly absence of the media, what are the other ways to keep us sunshine or spotlight on local government?
I mean, I think it's problematic because, city government, local government, special improvement districts are complex bodies, but there's a lot of transactions of revenues of public funds that, if someone isn't trained to understand, to look at the consent agenda and look at those, you're not going to have a good understanding of what's happening. By not having the outside there, that forces you to be much more transparent. I think we have to look at now with social media and different ways of how we're covering media to explore new ways to ensure that there's a much more transparency. I mean, one is we need an engaged public. Individuals in Bell took back their city, but at what cost? And people live busy lives, so we have to figure out through social media and other ways to ensure that how government is operating, its backup, that they're readily available to the public, that it's easily understood about how to follow agenda items and how to follow some of these complex issues, that individuals are involved in public budgeting. Part of the excuse that we make as public officials is it's too hard to understand. But it is our job to simplify. It is our job to make it understandable so people have a good sense of what's happening.
Well, again, thank you very much for
I appreciate you having me.
participating. Thank you for the book and the questions that it. Again, it's the book is called "The Failure of Governance in Bell, California: Big Time Corruption in a Small Town." Would commend you read it both as a story and the questions of what does it mean. So, Thom, thank you.
The following programming is made possible through a generous donation from Randall Lewis, Executive Vice President of Upland-based Lewis Operating Companies.